Please welcome to the stage Stephen Harper, former Prime Minister of Canada, and Derek Miller, President and CEO of the Salt Lake Chamber.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. We're so grateful to have you here, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to facilitate this discussion. Mr. Harper and I sat next to each other at dinner last night, and we covered a lot of different topics, all the way from China and Russia and Canada and Mexico and the U.S., all the way to the Canadian Football League. We're going to try to recreate some of that conversation now for you, and to provide a little bit of context to the questions I'm going to ask. I wanted to share with you a little bit about Mr. Harper's career. So if you'll permit me to read this. For nearly a decade, the Right Honorable Stephen J. Harper led Canada through the world's most complex geopolitical, economic, and security challenges as Canada's 22nd Prime Minister. He created the modern Conservative Party of Canada, won 3 successful national elections, and was the longest-serving Conservative Prime Minister since Canada's founding as its first Prime Minister in 1891. Since leaving office in 2016, Mr. Harper founded and is Chairman and CEO of Harper and Associates, a global consulting and strategic advisory firm. He also serves in a variety of capacities for public and private enterprises, including Chairman of Vision One, a fundamental value-oriented investment fund, and as directors of Colliers International Group. Has anyone heard of Colliers? Luke Kramer, where are you? Oh. Mr. Harper is the author of Right Here, Right Now, Politics and Leadership in the Age of Disruption, and a frequent speaker on geopolitics and business. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to the Right Honorable Stephen Harper. So as mentioned in the introduction, you came into office as the Prime Minister of Canada in 2006. Share with us what was happening in Canada, what was the state of the economy at the time, and as you assumed office, what particular focus did you have?
Yeah, great questions. First of all, thanks, Derek, for such a kind introduction, but thanks, everybody, for having me here. It's great to spend a little bit of time in Utah. I've been here a few times with my friend Mitt Romney at some of his summits, but never really spent a lot of quality time. And this is a state with a really fascinating history and a great future, and it's a very exciting place to be right now. In a world, I go around the world in business. There are not a lot of exciting places in the world right now, business-wise, but this is one of them. So thanks for having me. 2006. Look, brief history, the very brief political history of Canada. Our Confederation was established under a Conservative government, a Conservative Prime Minister in 1867. And he governed for most of the 19th century. After that, it generally became Liberal governments. And Conservatives tended to only get elected when everything was really bad, when we had real crises and the economy was in free fall. I was probably the first Conservative in, 80 years, 100 years, to be elected when times were actually pretty good. Long story as to how that happened. So, and look, I led essentially a new Conservative Party. It's a long story. We had a very divided Conservative movement. In the years leading up to that, I had brought them all together. So we didn't have a lot of experience in government, and it was fortunate in a way that we had that kind of really strong economy and pretty good balance sheet, because it allowed me to develop a platform really focused on a small number of very discrete and very deliverable items, and really got our feet wet. And then, of course, 2.5 years later, after we were established as government, in fact, had just been reelected, that then we were plummeted into the global financial crisis. So very, very fortunate that I wasn't saddled with that on day one.
Did you also call it the Great Recession in Canada?
I think we just referred to it more as the financial crisis. Canada, I don't know how much you recall there, Canada did pretty well in that period. First of all, we had no bank failures. no financial institution failures of any significance. So we did not have a problem in our financial sector. We were only impacted through the trade impact around the world. So our actual kind of radical downturn was steep, but we were out of it within a year. And by then, within a year plus, our employment levels were back to what they'd been. So, it was a relatively good time in Canada, which, to be frank, is one of the reasons why our government ended up being one of the very few Western governments got reelected after that period.
Tell us how you came to office, and you may have to provide a little bit of context for us Yanks about how the parliamentary system works.
Yeah, there's a little bit of context. Obviously, parliamentary systems are very different. The leader of the government is not the head of state. The prime minister is not the head of state. He's the leader of the government. He's the guy who essentially leads the majority in parliament. Like you and unlike you, we kind of have a two-party system. We have two major parties that tend to alternate in government, but we have smaller parties as well. On the other hand, while we have, quote, more parties are highly disciplined in Canada. It's not typical for members to publicly oppose each other as a party. That's kind of what we think a party is supposed to be, people who work as a team.
We used to think that too.
Yeah, I will try and avoid saying much about your politics.
We do that too.
Other than that, I was listening to President Fox, and sometimes people say, "Why don't you come and run down here?" And I say, "Well, apparently I'm way too young." As I say, we had the situation we had. When I was a young guy, I was involved in forming a new party, kind of what we would now call, the lack of a better term, the populist right. That party, I founded it. I served a term in Parliament. I left to go into private life. The party ended up having a civil war when I was gone, even though it had become the second largest party in Parliament. Because I was not part of the Civil War. I was really the only member of the party of any degree of profile who was not involved in the Civil War. I was then kind of drafted to come back and lead the party, and then was successful in pulling together the more traditional Conservative Party, forming a merger of a new party, and that's kind of how I got there. And then the other guys, the Liberal Party, which was then still 40 points ahead of the polls, then had their own civil war, which eventually made me the prime minister. So it was a really strange route that got me there, and I honestly tell people, no one believes it in Canada. Everyone believes if you become prime minister, it must have been an entire Machiavellian life plan. There's no possible way I could have planned all this, but I didn't think I would be prime minister until about 6 months before it happened.
Our former governor, Gary Harper, who's sitting over here, has often said that his biography would be titled An Unlikely Journey. It sounds like yours might be the same.
Yeah, an unlikely journey, but look, I tell young people now, and occasionally speak at the odd high school commencement or something, and I tell young people that the world is now changing so fast, and the workforce, labor market's changing so fast, so dynamic. I don't actually think you should have a lifetime plan. I always think you should find a passion, have a plan for maybe about 5 years, and then see what opportunities arise. I think that's the better way to do life. When my father's generation, you tried to get with a big company, you got your degree or credentials, you got with a big company, you stayed there for life. I just don't think that's the world anymore, and I don't think that's the way to kind of maximize the opportunities that your life, for young people, that your life is going to present you with.
That's great advice. So let's dig a little bit deeper into your economic plan. You were in office for 10 years as prime minister, of course, an MP for many more years than that. But what was some of the things you wanted to accomplish, and now looking back in hindsight, some of the things that you're most proud of during your term of service as prime minister?
Yeah, as I say, we were fortunate to come in when times were pretty good. Of course, I wouldn't have admitted that with the previous government at the time, but times were pretty good. The balance sheet was strong. But look, we had, I come, for lack of a better term, and certainly in the American context, I come from a kind of Reaganite conservative approach. And, our job was to, as I saw it, was to strengthen the economy by, in many ways, lessening the role of government, certainly lessening direct government ownership, creating a really good environment. One of the core principles of our government right from day one was to get our tax rates down. We reduced our sales taxes, our income taxes, certainly our corporate income tax, reduced virtually all taxes across the board. When I left office, and we had to run a big stimulus program during the recession, but when I left office in 2015, we had left Canada with a balanced budget and the lowest federal tax burden since the 1950s, which is fundamentally why Canadian economy performed pretty good for those years. At the same time, I thought we did the things that a government has to do. We had record investments in infrastructure, particularly trade-oriented infrastructure. We had made major transfers to our provinces for health and education policy. In fact, they were at record levels as well. So pretty proud of that record. That was a big part of the record that our successors very quickly mucked up. The other part of the record I'm very proud of that they did not muck up was what we did on the trade file. Canada, of course, has always been an open trading economy. But when I took office, Canada had trade agreements, free trade agreements, with only 5 countries in the entire world. When I left office, we had concluded agreements with 51 countries altogether, all of the major markets, most of the major markets in Europe, in the Americas, and also in Asia. So that, I think, is really of lasting benefit to the country.
Let's talk for a minute about trade. We're obviously here at a trade conference. Utah is an export state. It's a huge part of our economy, a top 10 state in the country for export increases, which says a lot about a state that doesn't have any seaports, and the Great Salt Lake doesn't count because those boats just go around in a circle. So you had a trade policy that you worked hard on. Last week in the Wall Street Journal, they pointed out that the one thing that both candidate Biden and candidate Trump have in common is that they want to elevate the trade wars. And now you are bringing a wealth of experience to advising companies around the country on these important issues. We are in a world that is complex and getting more dangerous. Advise these companies. How should they be thinking about this world and navigating those turbulent waters?
Sure. Maybe just companies, and if you don't mind, Derek, I'm going to kind of take a minute after that and go back to what I sort of advise current governments in North America. Look, when it comes to the companies, what I tell people is that we are in what I call the era of, for lack of a better way to put it, the beginning of the end of the period of naive globalism. And what I mean by that was at the end of the Cold War, an assumption began to take hold, implicit, not explicit, among governments, business, etc., that everybody was converging towards us, and therefore the differences in political systems around the world and the rivalries between them were a negligible business risk, or at least they were a constantly declining business risk. We now know that that assumption was not only wrong, in fact, it was foolish, and I say that because I never believed it myself. I actually fought with our business community about it. But we now know that's not the case, and so we're seeing a deglobalization trend take shape. Some of that is really good and really explicable because it is businesses like yours understanding that there are real business risks in being all over the world. There are supply chain risks, there are health risks around pandemics, there are national security risks, there are telecommunications risks, there are personnel risks, etc. Obviously, political risks in terms of the rivalries of governments. So you have to take those risks into account. I think the wrong the wrong thing to draw from that is to pull everything back to your country or to your state. I think it's still very beneficial to have, especially if you're obviously if you're a global operator, want to be a global company, it makes sense to be present in a lot of places, but try and have diversity in your supply chains and in your business activities, and obviously try to have that diversity more centered in fairly safe places to operate, allied nations, aligned nations, et cetera. So that's kind of what I advise businesses around the world and have been for some time. Look, governments, I want to say this because, obviously we're going to have an election here, and you not just got two presidential candidates who have, let's put it this way, different views on trade than was kind of conventionally the case in the last 20 years. And you're going to have a renegotiation of the USMCA coming up. You may be surprised to know that, it was really kind of President Trump who upset the apple cart on kind of trade perspectives. And I actually half agree with him on it, which I think some people would find surprising. The half I agree with him on was getting an entirely new approach towards China. I believe that the terms on which the United States and other Western nations admitted China to the World Trading System back in 2000 were absolutely terrible, and allowed the Chinese to essentially set the terms of trade between our countries in ways that has been predatory, has essentially allowed them to rack up ever larger surpluses that they are using for purposes that go way beyond the prosperity of their people, and are injurious to our interests. So I really do think there's a problem there. Where I disagreed with President Trump was his kind of lumping NAFTA in as kind of an example of the bad trade deals the United States had formed. On the contrary, I think, and not to say that the United States couldn't seek some improvements to the NAFTA arrangement, but NAFTA has seen tremendous two-way growth of trade between our nations, integrated supply chains, and frankly, given the challenges with China, and particularly given the differentiation of the Mexican economy, ways of really bringing some of those supply chains back to North America. So I think rather than see Canada and Mexico as trade adversaries, what the United States government should be doing is seeing us as potential allies and really orienting ourselves in a way to deal with the common adversary we actually all face, which is China, and our need to get much better trade relations with the Chinese state.
So we have just a couple minutes left, and I have just two questions left. Now it's time to get serious. I heard that Canadians like hockey, and you may have heard that Utah recently got a National Hockey League team. My question is this: how long is it going to take for Utah's NHL team to win the Stanley Cup? It's a question of either 1 year or 2 years. Give us your expert opinion.
Look, I was prime minister for 10 years and we didn't win the Stanley Cup. In fact, a Canadian team has not won the Stanley Cup in over 30 years now, which is unprecedented. Remembering, for those of you who've probably forgotten your history, the Stanley Cup was originally the National Hockey Championship of Canada. It's a Canadian trophy. So we are truly exporters.
So you're saying it's just 1 year. That's what you're saying, just one.
Well, let me give a serious answer to this. Some of you may know Derek, some of you may or may not know, I'm an amateur hockey historian. I've actually written a book on hockey history. My area of expertise is sort of a century ago, but that all said, it's a different, what you need to understand about hockey today, and I can't comment on other sports, but what's really changed hockey entirely is the era of the cap, the salary cap. It used to be a general manager would go out and just try and build the best team, best players in every position. That's not the secret anymore. The secret is, how do you manage your salary cap to get the best team within that restriction? And what's interesting, you had the Vegas Golden Knights come into the NHL, went to the finals their first year, were in the playoffs every single year except one, or just barely missed, and then 6 or 7 years later won the cup. How did they do it? They actually stumbled because they were an expansion team. They couldn't get any big stars, so they actually ended up managing their cap a lot better than the other teams. And we've seen this with new teams. So I think there is an opportunity for Utah. On the other hand, you are inheriting a franchise that has 30 years of failure behind it. So.
Okay, I got one last question, and this one's really serious. So I read, and this was on Wikipedia, so there's a 50-50 chance it's true, that you are a collector of vinyl records, and the collection includes the Beatles and AC/DC. Is this true?
It was true at one time. I certainly had a very complete collection, particularly the Beatles, but I gave it away to a vinyl collector, and I've gone digital. I'm modern on a few things, so I've gone digital on music.
Well, when I saw that it included the Beatles and AC/DC, I wanted to ask you if you've ever heard of a band named Rush.
Absolutely.
And
Big Canadian band.
And I also collect vinyl, and I brought a little gift for you to add to your collection of one of the greatest bands of all time, and this is one of the greatest live albums of all time, Exit Stage Left, which is what I'm going to do right now. But please keep this as a memento as your visit to Utah. Thank you. Please
Thank you very much.
Thanking the Prime Minister.